So this week we pick up with we're doing our summation of verses 2 through 20. We pick up with verse 5, and this is not a different subject. We're on the same subject. It's about what we as followers of God are supposed to do to stay holy. It's a summation. It's not an in-depth kind of a thing. There's more to it than this, but it's just kind of a summation of the things that you do day to day, or in other things that come up every once in a while, and how you should concern yourself and how you should live your life to be considered holy in the eyes of God. And oddly enough, all that stuff I was taught in the Pentecostal Holiness Church, not one of those things. So let's listen to what God says instead of some church organizations, especially if we're Jewish and not Christian. But I did spend in the Christian church. Uh, we did start off in synagogue. I do remember going to synagogue. I was about 4 years old. I remember a few years later when, well, I guess I was what 9 years old or so when we stumbled into the church. I remember years, a few years after the whole church thing started for us. I remember thinking, how come our last church didn't have a band? Why was there only a grand piano? Why was that stage so big and empty? Years later, I realized we were in a synagogue. We weren't in a church, but they had pews. Our synagogue had pews in it like the church did, and it had a big stage in the front. But if you didn't know the difference, as a kid, I didn't know the difference. I didn't have any idea that one was a synagogue and the other was a church, because they were very similar. The synagogue was much bigger and had a lot fewer people in it. And the church was packed wall to wall and always building bigger, 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 And that's back before a giant church was a thing. We just actually had that many people coming. So anyway, we're going to live a holy life according to God's law. And we're getting into this in the sacrifice of peace. Now remember, the Hebrew word shalom, is it the word they use here? Yeah, it's got to be shalom. Can't think of any other word for peace. But anyway, there's 3 Jews out there saying, oh, I can. At the moment, I'm not thinking of anything but shalom. But it's in plural. So it had to be shalamim. But it's in plural. It could be shalamot. I don't think they used shalamot back then. But anyway, it's one of the, some plural version of peace. So it's peace's sacrifice. But I don't want to say it that way without some kind of clarification, for fear that people are like, oh, is that when you break a glass, you got to make a sacrifice? Pieces of glass. Anyway, it's not that word, wrong spelling. This is Peaces, and there's no apostrophe, because this doesn't belong to the peace. So God tells us to make the peace sacrifices. And when he's in this particular case, we're not being told to, because this is a summation. We've already been told to. But in this one, it says when you make the peace sacrifices, or perhaps it could be translated if you make translations. What I started to say, if you make peace sacrifices, you're doing this for you. Do you guys remember that from just a few weeks ago? You're doing this for you. This isn't for God. So here's the funny thing. If you've ever read an English Bible, whether it's what we call the Tanakh among the Jews, or it's just called the Bible among the Christians, you get the feeling that the peace sacrifice is we have to make peace with God. Really? Is he part of Norse mythology or something? How did it ever get to that? How was it that our God got so petty and so jealous and so angry that we had to just make these little offerings to just make peace with God. We got to calm him down, right? Because that's the way it's translated. Well, the Jewish translators that started the whole translation process saw God as mean and vindictive and petty. They saw him that way because they at that time believed, and so we're talking about the time of the translation of the Septuagint and stuff like that. It probably preceded that, but for sure, was that first century CE? I don't actually know off the top of my head, but I think it was around the first century CE. They translated it into Greek, Septuagint, the Hebrew Bible into Septuagint. So for the Christians, that's the Old Testament. Those translators had come to believe that what happened at Sinai, Americans call it Sinai. Well, these days the Jews call it Sinai too, but not so much when they're speaking Hebrew, but when they say it in English, they'll say Sinai instead of Sinai. But anyway, the whole making of the golden calf, and here Moshe's up on the top of the hill with a hammer and chisel, putting this stuff in stone. And they say, well, make us some gods that will do what we want them to do, basically. No, they didn't say it that way. They weren't speaking English anyway. Make us gods that can go before us and blah, blah, blah. Because as for this Moses, the man, got to bring him down. He's just a human, just a lowly, just some dude that went off, and he probably got ate by a big old grizzly bear or something. We don't know where he is. We don't know if he's coming back. He's been gone for at least a month. See what I'm saying? And so the Jews saw that by the time of the first century BCE for sure. I was saying CE. I meant BCE, first century BCE. Could have been CE, but I think it goes back at least to the first century BCE. And that, by the way, was just the Torah. The rest of it came later, and nobody actually knows when it came later. There's all kinds of people who think they know and all kinds of books that talk about it, but in the end, nobody knows for sure when the rest of the Tanakh was translated into Greek. No one's positive about any of that. Just the part on and even the part that's the Torah, I don't think we can be absolutely sure because we don't have the original document in the first place. All we have are copies of copies of copies, and those break down over time, and the copies we have don't go back that far. But Josephus probably spoke about it. I'm not thinking of any time he did off the top of my head, but I haven't read everything he wrote. Some of the stuff he wrote was very boring. So anyway, I don't know for sure if he did or not, but somebody from that time period no doubt talked about it, and that's where they got the idea for the timing on it. But that doesn't really mean that that's when it was written. That doesn't mean that's when it was done, because even if Josephus had been around when it was done, or if it was around when Joseph was around, doesn't mean that it was done when he was around just because he spoke about it. It could have been there for 200, 300, 400 years. Probably not, but it could have been. Anyway, dating things like that are very difficult. But they believed that what happened at Sinai was so bad that God had essentially turned his back on the Jews. God had gone all the way back up into the heavens and has nothing to do with the humans since. Some still believe this to this day, that he went back to heaven and he's had nothing to do with human beings since. It helps some Jews to explain the Holocaust because they don't know that that's nothing in compared to what happened to the Jews in the first century CE, very end of it. They have no idea how many times there have been worse Holocausts than the one everybody thinks of when you say that word. Of course, that word didn't exist until after Hitler, but we lost a much higher percentage of the Jews in the end of the first century than what was lost in Hitler's time. And in that loss of we lost our homeland, we lost our temple. I mean, it was utterly leveled to the ground, and then all of Jerusalem was literally plowed under. And there are people who say, we don't know that for sure. Yes, we do. We have the historical documentation from the time period talking about it. And if you can read the Hebrew, it's very clear that they did that. And that's in conjunction with what the Greeks said about it. They said they did it, and people argued that they didn't because the Jews didn't say it. And it turns out the Jews did, in fact, say it. They did, in fact, write it down. And we do, in fact, have a copy of the original. I shouldn't say copy. We have the original. So we know it happened. You know, maybe you don't, but the historians ought to. Your rabbi ought to. It happened. They didn't just tear it down, they made it disappear. And when you go to Israel today and you walk down the Via Dolorosa and I can feel Jesus was here and I feel the death and you're 30 feet above where he was, 30 feet above where he walked. Somehow people don't know that, because, if you've got your little tourist destinations, you don't want them to know that this isn't real because they might go look for the real thing. And since you don't have control over that and can't make money off of it, maybe you don't tell anybody. Just maybe throwing that out there. But anyway, so they had the idea that God was so upset over what happened that he had turned his back on the people. And then by the time of the first century CE as well, they had come to the conclusion, oh man, I just lost my thought. Oh, no, it's there. It's gone. It's there. It's gone. Dang it. They had come to the conclusion that God had given his people a law that could not be adhered to. God had set his people up for failure on purpose. A law that you couldn't do. You know why they did that? Because now you can say, well, it's not my fault. Can't blame me. And since the Jews don't actually believe in a devil and hell, since it's not actually in the Bible, unless you're reading a translation, it's not in the actual Hebrew or the Greek of the New Testament for that matter. Yes, the word Diablo is in there. They had no concept of a devil back then. None whatsoever in Judaism. None whatsoever. So, but anyway, these people had come to believe, the Jews had come to believe that God had turned his back on his people and wasn't going to have anything to do with them until maybe when Messiah came, and that God had given them a law that they could not live by. And what that did is now you can sin all you want and say, well, it's not my fault. Nobody can live by the law. You know what I'm saying? So the Christians turn that into, well, the devil made me. Don't blame me. The devil made me do it. It's the same thing, just a different way of saying it. But if you sin, that's on you. It's not on somebody else. That's on you. You know if you're following God's law or not. Wait, I don't know the law. Then you know you're not following God's law. You can't follow it if you don't know it. So anyway, well, there are only 10 commandments. Yeah. Mr. Christian, you still going to church on Sunday? Working on Saturday? You know in the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 4, it says, and this is obviously, very obviously written by one of the disciples who followed Jesus, with air quotes, while he was alive, said, if he, speaking of Jesus, had given us another day of rest. I'm going to say it that way. You go look at the Greek and tell me I'm wrong. I know I'm paraphrasing here, but just go to the Greek and Don't even come to me. If you think that I'm wrong after looking at the Greek, I'm not going to talk to you. I'm changing my mind right here. He said, if he, speaking of Jesus, had given us another day of rest, wouldn't he have told one of us? That tells you that's one of the disciples who followed him for 3 years wrote that book. So Luke couldn't possibly have done that. He wasn't one of the 12. Y'all didn't know that, did you? Because you thought Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, he has to be one of them, right? Nope, he wasn't. Anyway, so it's one of the 12. Could have been Peter, because if you ever read the Greek text and try to translate that into Hebrew like I've done, that's actually the hardest text to understand. It was so well written, so eloquently written in Hebrew, and so horribly translated into Greek. That was difficult for me to go backwards and rebuild the Hebrew. It was very difficult. And then to take the Hebrew into English, well, that was way easier than the other stuff. But that guy was brilliant. And I think that when he said, it was talking about the guy they call Paul, his name was Shaul. He was talking about that man, and he said, the things that guy writes are really hard to understand, and if you haven't been trained like by a rabbi like we have, you can't possibly understand it. It's in there. He said that. Your translation doesn't. Why? Because none of them had that training. They didn't want it to be there, so they changed the words. They whitewashed it down. Is the translation false? No, it's. And the only example I know is something that happened to me. It's when I learned this little concept of situational truth. I was in a band. We'd been offered a record deal by Mercury Records, the biggest record label in the world. There are only 7 or 8 of them back in those days. And if you weren't on one of those labels, you were not on the radio. Your chance of getting a record deal, you could have won the lottery 4 times before you would have equaled the chances you had of getting a record deal. We had been offered a record deal. So the leader of the band came to us and said, hey guys, the attorneys who are writing up this contract said it'd be a lot easier to deal with one person instead of all 6 of us. What do you say we put this in my name and I just represent the band that way, and then we don't have to worry about it? And we're all like, that kind of sounds a little off. Are you planning on firing us or something? And he's like, oh no. And I'm going to call the band Lying Heart. Let's say the band was called Lying Heart. And this leader of the band said, where, because we asked him, are you planning on fire us? And I am using a false name, and I am purposely avoiding this man's name because he is very famous. He was very successful. He said, well, wherever Lying Singer goes, yes, the name I just gave him, what I say the band name was? Lying Heart goes with me. And we all stupidly thought that meant us because we were the Lying Heart band, right? You follow what I'm saying? So that's that situational truth. Well, the translation of Kepa is like that. It wasn't, well, it's kind of done for the same reason. They don't want you to know that he's saying if you're not trained by a rabbi the way he was, Peter, the guy they know as Peter, he was trained by a rabbi. He followed that man everywhere he went for 3 years. He literally served that man night and day. Those disciples made that man's food. Those disciples, if they had the provisions, made his bed. They, up until the moment he washed their feet, they washed his feet. They waited on him hand and foot, as did all of the other people. Because you think, oh no, Mary and Martha did that. Well, yeah, when they were at Martha's house. What do they do when they're out in the dust, walking around the desert, going from one town to the other? Hello, the disciples did that. Have you ever done that, Mr. Preacher Man? Have you ever done that, Mr. Rabbi Man? And a lot of people going around calling themselves rabbis. Okay, I better get off that subject before I get myself in trouble. So, on a very, very, very technical basis, the translation, you can argue that it's not wrong, but it is wrong because that man was literally saying that if you are not trained by a rabbi, you do not understand not one word that apostle Paul ever wrote. And I would say, nor any other word that any of the other disciples wrote or any other of the law and the prophets. You have no way to understand that. There are too many things missing from your knowledge. The disciples, who had been called dumber than the fish they caught by a man who had just been introduced as a God among men, when Yeshua, when Jesus met them, they were all fluent in the Hebrew language. They had all grown up in the Hebrew culture in, the area of Jerusalem in Israel. Talk about knowing the customs and the culture. They were making the history, they were living it. They know a bunch of stuff, all of that before they ever met Yeshua, before they ever met Jesus. They already had all of that. And by the way, by the time they were between the ages of 13 and 18, they had committed the entire Torah, all of the law that's from the chapter 12 of Exodus all the way to the end of Deuteronomy, that all of the law is contained in that. They had every last bit of that, and perhaps even all of Genesis, committed to memory. They knew it by memory before they were picked. And Americans who can't read Hebrew, they can't write Hebrew, they don't comprehend Hebrew, they don't know sin from shalom. Get it? Something from Shiloh. I don't remember the words. I don't remember how that goes, but I was making the connection. Sin from, anyway. That may be a bad thing. I better get off of that. But Americans who are reading a translation, they don't even know it's a fifth generation translation. They think it was translated from the original text. Why? Because their little Bible says so. Really? Really? Where did they get the original text that didn't exist when that stuff was translated? It didn't. It doesn't exist now, and it didn't exist then. There is no original Hebrew of the Torah or the Tanakh, any part of the Tanakh. That's the law, the prophets, and the writings. Torah is the T. N is the Nevi'im, that's the prophets, and then Tanakh, Ketuvim, the writings. That makes up what the Christians call the Old Testament. They had all of that law committed to memory. They spoke the language, they knew the customs, they knew the culture. They actually knew that Jesus did not wear rags. They knew he was a Pharisee. Oh no, Pharisees are the bad guys. You can't be calling Jesus a Pharisee. I'm going to turn this off right now. Okay, look at what John the Baptist, John the Baptist. Let's look at what he said. It says he was talking to the Pharisees, and he said to the Pharisees, there is one, capital O, small n, small e. There is one among you. What does that mean? That means that Yeshua, Jesus, was a Pharisee. It's right there in the New Testament. And if Jesus was a Pharisee, he being a rabbi, we know he was a rabbi, they called him rabbi right there even in the Greek text. There is no Greek word for rabbi. But if you look at the Greek text, and I'm going to use our alphabet so that you know what I'm getting at. In the Greek text, it spells out R-A-B-B-I. Yeah, that's called transliteration. Translation is to tell you what something means. Transliteration, on the other hand, is to spell a word from some other language with your letters so that the reader in your language can come fairly close to pronouncing a word properly. And by spelling it Rabbi, if you will, we learn to say rabbi. And that is proper. Just saying. Just throwing that out there. Rabbi is proper. By using our letters, we now know how to say the word properly. In fact, if you spell out another Hebrew word, Amen, amen, that's a Hebrew word, by the way. It comes from the Hebrew. What are some other ones? Nah, let's get off that. Okay, so these people who had none of what Peter said, it's 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 4, something like that. Go look it up. That's where he said, if you're not trained by a rabbi, you don't know what you're doing at all. You have no idea. And he was telling his readers, don't follow somebody like that. That's what it says. Go look it up. I may be off a verse or two. I think I'm right on it, but I'm pretty sure it's 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 4. Somebody, if you got a Bible, look at that. Okay, I'm seeing fingers. What? 16. 16 what? 3:16. Oh, yeah, like John 3:16. I knew there was some connection I used to have with that. Because I'm thinking of the other one that I like, 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. And I was thinking there's like John 3:16. So it's 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 16. Now we got it right. Thank you, Rich. Good thing he was here. Anyway, I can't remember everything. I'm sorry. I did translate the entire New Testament in 2 different languages, but I can't remember it all. I mean, that's an awful lot to have to commit to memory, especially since I'm trying to commit the law to memory. Anyway, so he's saying don't follow people like this. And so, a few years later, maybe 1,000 years later, translators come along and they begin to translate into this brand new language. Into the 1200s, English was a brand new language. And if you tried to read something that was written in the 1200s, I promise you could do it, but you're going to have to put a lot of effort into it. The spelling of English words is bizarre. 90% of them end in an E. I don't care what the word is, all as in you, all, A-L-L-E. I'm sure. I don't know if positive, but it almost for sure has an E at the end of it. That I don't know what that was about, but all of the dang words seem to have an E after them. Then the words are bizarre. The spelling is very bizarre. And it doesn't really, when you read it, you finally get the hang of reading something as weird as that. Most of it doesn't make any sense to you. English was a very different thing when it began. And it has changed and changed and changed over the time. In fact, most people don't know this, but our alphabet has changed many times. There used to not be a J in our alphabet. That only happened like 500 or 600 years ago. So no, there was no Jesus. There was no Joseph. Who else? Joshua. No, none of those. That did not exist. There was a Yeshua, Joshua, Yehoshua. Everything was yeah. We didn't have a J. Or did we have a sound of J there? There was no Jesus. There was, in the first century, there has never been a human being from any place or any time named Jesus. That did not happen. His name was Yeshua. And it wasn't Yehoshua, Yahakawakahu, whatever you come up with, try to connect that name to God, which is the biggest bunch of baloney I have ever heard in my life. That sacred name thing was invented by a dentist, not a Bible scholar, a dentist who didn't know sin from Shinola. Is that nasty? Does that come from? Oh yeah, there's a bad word in the original. Okay, I should think of something other than that to say. I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to connect it to something bad. No scholar, no Bible knowledge, no language, no history, customs, culture, none of that stuff. He just came up with this idea. And now you've got people, Jews, born and raised Jews, running around saying Yehoshua and Yahachakahoya. I don't know. I can't even pronounce it the way they do, because they're trying to take the name of God and connect it to Yeshua. And so they're coming up with all these different things. And somebody told them, well, one of the letters had a sound. No, it didn't. No, linguistically speaking, that did not exist. Just because they call it a hard sound does not mean that it has a Think about it. How about the word boy? That B is soft. But if I say Victor, that V is hard. So am I supposed to now say Victor? That's how dumb that is. That's how far off base that is. If you're doing that nonsense, quit. The name of the man they call Jesus, the man who lived, who walked on water and all that stuff, his name was Yeshua. That is exactly how it's pronounced. How do I know? Look at the Greek text. It spells out Yeshua. I may have to show you that image one of these days so you can see that that's where it came from. Yeshua was his name. That's what he was called. And no, his name was not Yehoshua, shortened to Yeshua. His name was Yeshua. We'll get into that. If you guys throw a fit, I'll teach on that one of these days and take you through the whole linguistical thing. It's very boring, but I'll take you through it if you want me to. Anyway, so I'm saying all this to say this. These people who saw God that way and were not qualified in any way, shape, or form, which is like 98% of the sages. They didn't speak Hebrew. They had never been in Jerusalem. They were not raised Jewish. They were making up a way to be Jewish. And so what did especially Rashi do? He stole everything he knew from the church, literally stole it from the church. Have you ever read his works? He's pretty open about it. But no, you don't read his works. What do? You go to synagogue and they mention his name almost every time you turn around, because he's the more of a false prophet somebody is, the more likely he's going to be the most popular, right? And the more false some teaching is, the more likely how popular that teaching is going to be. And Rashi is a great example of that, just as Maimonides is. That man never spoke a word of Hebrew. He never wrote a word of Hebrew. If you read his own writings, there's a story in there about how somebody wrote him. And if you're reading this in the language for which he wrote it, it's very clear that somebody else added a little something in here, because the writing style completely changes. It's obviously not the same author, but it goes in there and tells this story about how this guy writes to Maimonides and says, "Oh, Maimon, what do I do? I don't speak Hebrew. I'm really struggling with this," because they spoke, was it Arabic or Aramaic? I think it was Arabic. It almost had to be Arabic at that time. So they're speaking Arabic. Well, that's a Shemitic language, and we have a whole lot of words that are very similar. We Jews say Avraham, they say Ibrahim. Well, if you're Jewish and you're used to speaking Hebrew, you know that the vowel sounds that you just heard mean nothing. For my last name, for instance, is spelled Allon in English. And so a lot of people try to call me Robert Alon. No, that is not how you pronounce that Hebrew word. That Hebrew word is pronounced alone, like the word alone. But I don't go around telling people my last name is Alone, because how do you think they're going to spell my last name? But in Hebrew, my last name is actually Allen, because in Hebrew, it doesn't make any difference if you spell it Elon, Elon Musk. That's the same as my last name. If you spell it Allan, Allen, Alun, the verbs mean nothing when it comes to the meaning of the word. The verbs make no changes in the meaning of that word. The only way you can change the meaning of my last name is if you spell it with one L, that means oak tree. If you spell it with two, that means mighty oak tree. That's as close as you can come to changing the meaning of any given word in Hebrew. The vowel pointings make it masculine, feminine, first, second, third person. What's some other things? Future tense, past tense. That's what the vowel sounds do. They have no effect on the meaning, but they are important if you're going to try to understand the sentence, right? So my last name actually is properly pronounced Allen for all intents and purposes in America. In Israel, I expect to be called Robert alone. Okay, anyway, so these people who know nothing about the history, the customs, the culture, they certainly did not know I was going to tell you about Maimon. So there's a story about how this guy, oh, Maimon, how did you learn Hebrew? And Maimon said, oh, you just, meditate and you just go ahead and read it and sound it out and it'll come to you because that's the way I did it. And on the very next page, we go right back in the case of my book, the one that I have, it may be different in your book because this is supposedly everything that he wrote. You flip the page and the next page, he clearly says that he doesn't speak the Hebrew language and never has written anything in the Hebrew language. These are the people teaching you the Torah that's written in Hebrew? No, the best they could do was the Aramaic. And maybe, no, I'm pretty sure Maimon had to have spoken Arabic because he was the Sultan of Swing or something. Dun, dun, dun. Anyway, some of you get that. I'll help myself out. He was the physician to the Sultan, or as he's called. He was actually a witch doctor, not a medical doctor. We didn't have medical doctors back then. That's nonsense. The guy in the New Testament, was it Luke? Or Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. So Luke was not a physician. That did not exist in the first century. There was no such thing as medical training. You did not become a medical doctor. Hello, that's way ahead of time. That's way ahead of that time. You had people who made little potions to give to you to make your headache go away, or maybe they made a little, what was that pill from Princess Bride? And they painted the chocolate on it to make it go down better. I can't think of what that was called. Darn, that would have been really good for this. They made stuff like that. They made things out of herbal things and stuff like that. And some actually apparently were quite successful with things like that. That's not a physician. They called them healers. The word is actually healer. It means healer, not physician. He was not a medical doctor. He was a doctor of the law. That I will agree with, because there is no Jew in that time who would have listened to a non-Jewish doctor of the law. That's how they get he has to have been a Greek, because one, his name is Greek. Well, hello. Almost everybody in the New Testament had a Greek name, and it's clearly Shaul, who was called, what was it? Paul. That's Greek, right? Palos. That's Greek. We now say Paul, but back then they said Palos. He was a Jew. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. Remember? Studied under Gamaliel. No Jew, no Greek would have been studying under Gamaliel. You follow what I'm saying? Yeshua, by the way, if you read the English text, did not have two Greek brothers, and he did not have two Greek disciples. Sorry, that didn't happen. Anyway, what was I talking about? It's just people like this who don't know the language, they don't know the customs, they don't know the culture, they're just making it up as they go. They're stealing it from the church. Rashi being the worst offender of them all. And Maimon being the worst offender as according to somebody making things up. He translated the Hebrew, for the law that, what was that called? The something Torah, the Sefer Torah, I think was the name of the book. I actually went in and translated that. Wow, was he off? Woo, was he off? But maybe it was helpful for the time. I don't know. All I'm saying is everything that the New Testament says about people like that is hands off, get away, don't listen to them. And these are the guys that came up with these ideas that God gave us a law we could not follow. Really? So your God is mean and vindictive, setting you up for failure? Your God is going to punish you with lightning bolts and sickness and illness and death because what? You forgot to wear your fringe today? Really? And send you to hell for all eternity because you don't know that he started things off with the Jews, got fed up with them, and jumped over to the Christians? Really? God's not like that. And these people did not know what they were talking about. Peace sacrifice is not to make things right with God. It is not to appease God. That's the word I'm looking for. It's not about appeasing God. And God said clearly in verse 5, peace sacrifice is for you. You. Let's say you get up early one morning and you pour yourself a fresh cup of coffee and you walk out on the back porch and you watch the sunrise and you're overwhelmed with thanksgiving and awe at the God who created something like that you can experience almost every morning of your life. Not every morning. I mean, sometimes it's raining outside, sometimes it's snowing outside. So it's not all the time, but well, I should say in some places it's not like this where we live close to the equator. That's pretty much almost all the time. But because we get less rain, we don't get snow, we don't get ice, except every 100 years apparently. So we get a lot more sunrise and a lot more clear sunrises than others. So I may be privileged there over others, but sometimes something like that will just take you away. It will just overwhelm you with thanksgiving and gratefulness to a God who loved his people so much that he would give them such beauty all around them. And we can be upset about all the politics going on. The one side can be angry at the other, and the other side can be angry at the one. Hopefully I kept that straight. And they can all accuse each other of being demons out of the pit of hell, and you guys need to be out of power, and you guys need to be in. It doesn't make any difference what it is, where you fall on that. It doesn't make any difference if you believe in 2 genders or 450,000 genders or what. I don't even know what the number is, and it doesn't matter to me. And it shouldn't matter to you. I mean, if you're in that, if you're one of the people pushing the gender thing, obviously that matters to you. And I'll give you that. If it matters to you, I'm okay with that. It's okay if it matters to you. But if it doesn't matter to somebody else, I'm okay with that too. And I wish everybody would just kind of agree to that. If it's important to me, then it's important to me, and that's okay. And if it's not important to them, then it's not important to them, and that's okay. Because think about it. Why is this such a big deal? People go around, I don't believe in God. Really? You've spent half your life making sure that every Christian you ever met knows that you don't believe in God. You're an atheist. Really? How many times have you met people and told them you don't believe in do we have a young aunt? No. How many times have you told them you don't believe in the Easter Bunny? Come on, nobody believes in the Easter Bunny unless you're that tall. Well, you can't see the floor, can you? It's not very far under my hand. Unless you're a little kid, you don't believe in stuff like that. A little kid believes in Santa Claus if that's what they're taught. If you're Jewish, you believe in the Santa Armadillo. What was that in Friends? You see the episode? He couldn't get a Santa Claus suit because his wife was he was Jewish. His wife was a Gentile, so he tried to get a Santa Claus suit, I think. And he wound up in a big old armadillo suit. So he was Santa Armadillo or something like that. So as Jews, we get Santa Armadillo. The Christians get the guy in the red suit and the big white beard, which that don't seem right. We're the ones with the white beard. Anyway, You believe in that stuff when you're a kid, if that's what you've been told. Eventually, you won't believe in that anymore. You may believe in the spirit of it, but you won't believe in those people. You know, they weren't real. And you don't go around telling everybody how you don't believe in it. You don't go around spending, an hour or two, three a day telling everybody that you don't believe in Santa Claus, but you'll do that with God. I say that's proof that you do believe in God. You're just mad at him for something. Sorry. Well, if you're thinking of God the way these guys think of God, I can understand you being mad. Going to go to hell just because you don't know something. No, that's not the God of the Bible. That's the God of people that you've been warned not to listen to. It's good advice, whether you're Jewish or Christian. It's really good advice. If they weren't trained like the rabbis were trained in the first century and before, you probably shouldn't listen to them. Just saying, if they don't speak Hebrew, don't listen to them. And yes, by the way, I am trained that way. And yes, by the way, I do speak Hebrew, Bible Hebrew. Don't come up here and start talking to me about auto boost. That's like the only modern word I know. That's a bus. What do you call a plane? An auto bird? I don't know. I don't know any. I know almost no modern Hebrew because I don't want that to mess up my understanding of biblical Hebrew, because they are two completely different dialects. No, let me put it more succinctly. They are two different languages. Just because you speak Hebrew and read the Torah does it. If you have not been trained by a good rabbi, if you haven't learned the difference in the meanings of the words, because they mean almost the opposites in modern Hebrew as to what they do in the Bible, you can't even understand it, and you speak Hebrew. God is not mean and vindictive. He does not have to be appeased. We make these sacrifices because we are so thankful and so grateful and just want to give something to God. And how do you give it to God? You have a barbecue and you give part of that food to a man of God. It could be a woman of God. There's no rule that says it can't be a woman of God. Yes, there were women of God. Don't tell me that Huldy and the bumblebee, what was her name? Deborah. Don't tell me those weren't women of God. Don't tell me Sarah wasn't a woman of God. You know what I'm saying? Don't tell me there's no women of God. They need to be in service of God. But if you want to do that, have a peace offering. It's called a barbecue in today's language, in English. That's a barbecue. You get the meat, you put it over the open fire, you cook it. Part of it goes to the person of God, and part of it goes to you. And you're doing that, God said, for you. Because, see, God's not mean and vindictive. He did not turn his back on his people. And part of us being holy is our celebration that's for us to God. Now, how much time do I have, Donna?
8 minutes.
Oh, okay. Because I have 11 and a half by that clock. Now, if you make that sacrifice, I'm going to move on to 6 because with 8 minutes, I know I can get through this. I didn't mean to ramble on, but that's kind of a sore issue for me to take the God who created this world simply so that he could have a dear, sweet friend. And he's such a big God that we cannot comprehend that he needs, like more friends than the stars that can fill the entire universe to feel fulfilled. It's the only thing God ever did for himself. And he created this entire universe and all that it is and will be just so that he could create human beings that had choice. You can choose to live for God and be his friend, or you can choose not to live God and not be his friend. No, you are not going to a fiery hell if you don't. You're going to a place called darkness. What does that mean? You're going to run around bumping into stuff in the night? No. Darkness means that you're never going to stand in the presence of God. You're going to be in a place where God is. You're going to see him from across what's called the wadi in Hebrew. It's a big ditch, if you will. But you'll never be able to cross it. That's because if you don't live according to God, that's what the Jews have always called blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, because the law of God is the Holy Spirit. The law itself is the Spirit, and because it's the Spirit of God, it's holy. So, Holy Spirit, Spirit of God, they're talking about the law. The Spirit, as in, this is what makes God tick. Anyway, God is good. But if you make this sacrifice, in verse 6, it says, on the first and the second day, you can eat the meat that has been cooked on that day. Chips and other, that don't have anything to do with it. Whatever you add to it's fine. But, well, as long as it's not pork and, squid and poop eating stuff. I can't even, ew. But on the first and the second day, you can eat that. But if there's leftover on the third day, you must destroy it. Burning it is best. I don't remember if it actually said it had to be burned.
Blessing vaYiqra.
It's in verse 6. What chapter are we in? 19? Yeah, 19:6. Look it up. If it says burn it, then you have to burn it. I just off the top of my head, I've gone blank. I don't remember. But if it doesn't say burn, yes, you can feed it to your dog. Your dog is not Jewish. No matter how Jewish you are, your dog is not. Even if you have one of them dogs that actually has the payah. Have you ever seen one of those? Oh, man, we begged this couple to give us their dog once because of that payah. It's the sidebird, the curly cues. Anyway, so when you get to the third day, that stuff has to go away. You're not allowed to eat it. And you know what happens in verse 7? If you do eat it on the third day or after that, God doesn't accept that sacrifice. It's as if you just had another meal, except now you're unclean because you did this on the guise of we're celebrating God. It's for your benefit, but you're celebrating God. And if you celebrate God and then eat on the third day, what have you done? You have marginalized God in your celebration. That makes you unclean. So what does that mean? Eternity in hell? Nope. It means you now have to make a sin sacrifice. Dang, you have to have another barbecue. Don't do it on purpose, people. I don't know what happens if you do a double whammy there. But we'll talk about that next week. Shalom, shalom, everybody.
The blessing vaYiqra. Yevarecha Yahweh v'yish merecha. Ya'er Yahweh panai v'lecha v'hunecha. Yisa Yahweh panai v'lecha v'yasim lecha shalom. And in English, may Yahweh cause you to lie down so that you may rest. May he touch and caress you. May he prepare you for what is ahead. May he watch over you. May he keep you from harm. May he cause goodness to grow in you and take away the bad. May he arrange your life and cause you to flourish. May he cheer you up and gladden your heart. May he cause his light to shine through you. May he show you tenderness, favor, and love in his presence. May he show you kindness and be delicate towards you. May he show you his generosity, mercy, compassion, and desire for you as it comes forth from the depths of his soul. May he lift you out of your pit and deliver you from the things that hold you prisoner. May he draw you to his chest and cast his eyes on yours. May he show you his love and desire for you as he cradles you in his arms. May he bear your punishment and pardon you of your sin. May he take you for his bride. May he establish a foundation in you. May he place his name on your heart and mind and make your body his temple. May you be his treasure. May you always be on his mind. May he draw you near and comfort you when you are afraid. May he assure you there is nothing to fear because he is with you. May you and all that concerns you be at peace because he is your friend. Amen.